Hey, Guru, Iboya, Ibucheche, everybody in Cyberlands, your fair Babalao. At least I hope so. Omodun, Odileke coming at you with another great live early in the morning in order to capture my folks in the European theater, in order to give some leeway to those who live in different parts of the world. But nonetheless, here's the reason why I'm doing this episode. So in episode 1 and 2 in the membership thread, I started to go over, right? Episode 1, which is receiving your hand of Ifá, your warriors. What does that mean? Where does that take you? Right? In episode 2, we're going to go, or in episode 2, we started to talk about what does that first level take you? How do you attend? What are some of these things that you can do? What is the true concept behind your hand of Ifá and your warriors? In this episode, a lot of confusion, I think, is spread around the faith because no one has just come out and said, "Hey, listen, you know, you receive fundamental orishas on your way, right? And some of these fundamental orishas or some of these actions, have to be performed at a certain point in time based on the lineage that you have, and that's something that's important for us to understand." Right. So I wanted to kind of make sure I touch on that. But like always, hey, I appreciate each and every one of you for coming and tuning in. And for those who are going to tune in late, I am always interested in your feedback, your comments, your messages. Please feel free to shoot me a message. Please feel free to drop something in the chat if you're on here. And with that said, let's dive back in. So hey, as always, your little boy Bucheche, your favorite Babalao. One more doing Dileke coming at you. All right. So a couple of things that I think that's going to be critical to cover to ensure that nonetheless, we truly capture some of the fundamentals of what's next, right? And when I say what's next, the first thing we have to look at, right, is the advice that you received in your Ita when you received your hand of Ifa. But not necessarily the advice. I already kind of spoke on that in episode 1. But now, after we look at the advice, which is the 3 signs that you received in your hand of Ifa, or for the Babalaos, the 3 signs you received when you did, when you went through Ibaud, but more importantly, even the Itas that all Orishas receive, right? All that information is truly complemented by the Eboses, right? The Ebo during an Ita, a sacred union, right, of either receiving your hand of Ifa, which is now you becoming part of that cult, or cult's a bad word, but I guess that pack or that tradition, whether it's Orumina or maybe you got crowned and maybe you went through some form of transition. Those eboses are things that are going to be marked, that are going to reinforce your life. I always tell people it's kind of like if you were a knight, right? And think about back in the day, the king, the queens, the knights, right? They're fighting and going into battle, right? And imagine if you were the knight and you had armor, right? You had the chest plate, you had your helmet, you had your legs, you had everything set up, right? You got your sword, your shield. Okay. This is what that next step after you receive your warriors and your hand of Ifa, right? This is what that means. Those bosses begin to tell you what type of chest plate do I need? What type of armor do I need, right? Collectively, right? For some, you're going to see where Olokun is very fundamental, and Olokun becomes one of those plates, right? Orisha Oko becomes one of those plates. Ori, Orun, Ozain. Hey, I got to feed the earth, right? We need to do a spiritual Misa. We need to do a spiritual mass in order to investigate your Eguns. And we got to see how that drives us. Where does that take us? Right? Hey, how do I avoid rushing ahead? Right? How do I develop? Right? There's going to be a lot of advice in your bosses, right? When they start to tell you, hey, you got to go do this, you got to receive this. Hey, that ebo, right? And those ebos that are marked are merely one of the steps, right? In order to kind of generate where do you go next, and what armor do you need? So I wanted to kind of explain to you who is Olokun, because Olokun is one of those fundamental Orishas. That means that everybody at a certain point in time is going to receive Olokun. Orisha Oko, another fundamental Orisha that a lot of times people are going to find themselves having to receive Orisha Oko, right? And sometimes one comes before the other, and that's fine. You know, when we talk about Eguns and the power of the Eguns in the side of Ifá and how those things are received, when those things are received, when we talk about Orun, talk about Ozain, we talk about Ode, right? We talk about Odudua Vifa. A lot of these things start to kind of lay themselves out and they layer on top of each other. And there's definitely more to that, right? But those are kind of the typical fundamental orishas that you're going to constantly hear throughout your journey, right? So I want to go ahead and just kind of jump right in so that you guys kind of have an understanding. All right, let's talk about just the fundamental orishas before we get into how do we feed the earth. How do I get my spiritual misa? What does that mean? What does that drive? Right. So Olokun, excuse me, Olokun is at the end of it all. Olokun represents stability, right? Mental, emotional, financial, right? So we look at things from that perspective of prosperity and health to a certain point. Right? Without Olokun, many people stay at the surface level of life. Right? You got to remember that these metaphors actually tie into the spiritual richness that comes into your way. Now, they get tossed by every wave of emotion and drama. Olokun was tied to the ocean because even the metaphors tie into where your spiritual growth goes. So if I say you're at the surface level, right, then I tell you, hey, you need to dig a little deeper, right? If I tell you that you're going to get tossed by the waves on the top of the ocean, then that means you need to build that stability. And Olokun begins to offer that to ensure that you get to where you got to get to, right? In today's world, right? A lot of things that I see happening is that people are suffering from anxiety, mental health issues are everywhere, right? And Olokun grounds you. Olokun gives you the advice, whether you receive Olokun from Ocha or whether you receive Olokun of Ifá. And we're gonna dig into those two differences soon, right? The depths of the sea, right, does not shake from the surface storms, right? Olokun, you gain that resiliency that you need. And that's something that you just have to kind of hang on to. And Olokun allows you to navigate those challenges that you have in your life. And when we look at Olokun, right, we almost gotta see the story of Olokun, right? And I know I said I want to talk about Olokun of Ifá and Olokun of Ocha. I'm gonna save that for another episode because that's a deep conversation, so you can have the general understanding. But Olokun is Olokun; it doesn't change from what lineage you get it from or not. But Olokun is the mysteries. Olokun is the first elder, right? When we talk about the pantheon of Orishas, the pantheon of Iremoles, right? That need to be understood. And when I say Iremoles, I'm talking about the original beings that were created by Olodumare, by God. And Olokun is one of those grand elders. This is the reason why Olokun has to be represented. Another reason why most of the earth is covered by water, right? Olokun has a lot of presence in this world that needs to be understood. And for the children of Yemaya or the children of Olokun, the children of a lot of times the water divinities, we see a certain trend where they receive the Olokun of Ifá, right? Now, for the children of Olokun, 100% you got to receive, the Olokun of Ifá. For the children of Yemaya or Chun, very rare do I see, children of Inle. But for the water divinities, at a certain point in time, Olokun of Ifa is going to be very fundamental in your life. Nonetheless, for everybody else, Olokun of Ocha is perfectly fine. Save yourself some time and money and don't necessarily jump to Olokun or Ifá because you feel that that's going to give you the edge, right? Again, very fundamental in this faith, right? Olokun or Ifá is very, very much built with a lot of work, a lot of ingredients. It comes with an Ita, 3-day Ita, or Olokun Ocha. It's not a 3-day process, it's a 1-day process. You don't necessarily get any Da, but you do get guidance. And you do get an Odu that walks with you in the Delegun system. So that's one. Now, hopefully everybody understands that. I don't necessarily see anything in the chat, so I'm going to keep on pushing through. Some of the things about Olokun, you got to look in the Odun of Yobe, Obesa, right? Obeyono. And I mentioned these particular oduns because these particular oduns begin to generate a certain level of understanding. In Yobe, we understand that that is the beginning of all things. Olokun, water, the source of all things. We look at Obesa saying, hey, we got to do everything correctly. We got to do everything fast, but necessarily do it right. Right. And on Beyono, we start to kind of see where the Orishas were introduced into this world and they were given their lineages, right, and their domains of what those Orishas do and can do for this world, right? So it started to build their attributes, their territories, etc. And Olokun is very fundamental in all these Oduns going forward. So hopefully we have a good understanding on that. So then we talk about in this episode, I'm going to talk about Orisha Oko. Okay. Orisha Oko is one of these Odun, or I'm sorry, one of these Orishas that you begin to kind of see. They come out of the Odun of Otura Ogunda, Obeyono as well, Osa Ogunda, right? And you see my trend here, right? Olokun and Orisha Oko are very much represented heavily in Obeyono. And I just told you that's the foundation. That's where the Orisha started to get their characteristics or domains. This is another reason why these Orishas are fundamental. And like I said earlier, this is like you putting your armor on. This is like you making sure that you have all your spiritual gear on in order to tackle the world. You need the fundamentals nonetheless. So let's look at Orisha Oko now. So Orisha Oko, right, governs justice, governs health, fertility, and an earth connection, right, with the other side. Have you ever noticed that if Orisha Oko is something that we always describe Orisha Oko as the hole, right, in the ground. We always just describe Orisha Oko as the whenever a farmer is plowing his land in order to place the seeds, Orisha Oko is represented through that bull, that action of plowing the earth in order to get those seeds in there, right? But think about it for a second, right? If you put the seed in the ground, but you don't nurture the seed, then the seed is not going to grow effectively. That's my point right there. So Orisha Oko begins to offer you that connection with the earth, ensure that the seed that you planted when you received in episode 1, your warriors and your Hand of Ifá. In episode 2, how do we maneuver them? We're nurturing this concept. And now Orisha Oko comes in, and now he begins to kind of ensure that that connection is there and builds that pack or builds that armor on top of you. So now your spiritual refortification begins to kind of solidify itself even more. So that's something we got to think about. So then many people today, right, are spiritually disconnected, right? They're disconnected from nature. They're not necessarily, connected as well as they should. And they begin to question the very divinities and the very actions they have taken, right? So I receive my warriors, I receive a Hand of Ifá, I don't necessarily feel something, I don't necessarily see things driving forward, and they begin to question themselves, right? So what does that mean, right? So if many people are feeling disconnected from nature, it shows up, right, as a physical illness, or someone is now anxious, right? And then now someone has blocked energy, right? But this is what Orisha Oko offers you. It offers you the connection so that you can break free from that concept of blocked energy. The fertility, because maybe you're trying to create something, whether it's a profession, whether it's a family, whether it's a relationship, right? Maybe it's time to, hey, I need to look at myself physically and in order to ensure that I'm healing myself from the inside out, right? But also allowing the spirituality to come in to complement everything and bring it together. That's what Orisha Oko offers. Orisha Oko, that when I say that earth connection, also connects you and helps you with the side of the Egun, your spirits, where your spirits are taking you. How are they taking you? And if we don't have an effective connection with Orisha Oko, then we begin to see where blockages are going to be existent because you can't break everything down. You're going to need some divine intervention. Today, we kind of see, that we live in an artificial environment. Right now, where we're talking through is an artificial environment. This is you and I having a conversation, but it's between a monitor, a camera, a mic that I have here, right? And the concrete, the plastic, right? Those digital screens that we have, right? When we receive Orisha Oko, we begin to restore the bonds that we have with nature. We balance our bodies and we support the natural healing of things. I believe that Orisha Oko is more important now today because children today, people today, don't necessarily maneuver like I used to maneuver when I was born several decades ago. We're not going to say the age. So we need to be more solidified today than we did before. If you look at history, we had hunters, we had gatherers, right? We had people that were pushing forward with nature and always connecting and respecting those bounds. And it was a one-on-one. Now you go to the supermarket, now you're stuck on TikTok and YouTube and you're screening and you're scrolling through scrolls and feeds and we were losing the connection with the outside, right? Purely because of concrete, plastic, digital screens, right? And little microchips, right? So then Orisha Oko is more important today than ever, right? In order to support that natural healing and that natural connection that's necessary. Okay. Now, let's go even further. Ori. I chuckle at this a lot because a lot of times people always say, well, why do I have to receive Ori? I thought Ori was inside me. And I say, well, no. Ori is 100% supported through your subconscious mind. Ori is 100%, supported by your urges and your desires. Ori is 100% the most powerful Orisha or the powerful energy and the most powerful energy you're ever going to encounter and receive and have inside you and internalize. Ori is the one that's going to reveal through Orumila, right, where you need to go or how you need to get there. Ori is what is communicating when we begin to start to do concepts of osode, consultations with Ifá, when you're doing, let's say, connections with different, maybe the Egun systems, different divinations. That's Ori. And like Orisha Oko and like Olokun, Ori, the Oduns of Ori, live in Eyobe, live in Obe Ogunda, Obeyono again, right? I'm not going to reintroduce that concept again. You guys get it? You got Ogunda Yeku, Otura Meji, Salam Aleikum, Aleikum Salam Nangarin, Yare Ifá Male. So then you begin to kind of see, quite a few things here when we talk about Ori, right? Just on that understanding alone. But the key thing about Ori, right, and making it fundamental is that Ori is your supreme Orisha, right? No other Orisha or even Ifá can override your Ori. And you got to kind of think about that process. Ori now offers you straight advice on how it lives and maneuvers. And if you better understand your Ori, right, you better understand how you're going to be successful. Ori is something that's given through Ifá because remember, Orumila is the witness to destiny. the Deepen, right? A direct descendant, right? Through the raw power of Olodumare. But also, Orumila and the connection with Ori is why you receive Ori through Ifá. Now, Ori comes with an Ita, right? When you receive it with Ifá, we get to kind of figure out what's your toyale, what's your witnesses, what's your prophecy, what are those ebos. We go back to where we started with this video. Those ebos, understanding that ebo is going to be key, right? In order to ensure that we're solidifying our connection with Ori, right? Obviously, we want to follow the taboos and the advice and everything else, but we already kind of addressed that in episode 1 on how we kind of interpret those itas, and maybe we look at that again later, but that is something you got to look at. So Ori now becomes the helmet in your battle as a knight, right? And you move forward, right? Olokun is that chest plate, right? Orisha Oko becomes the feet, right? The armor for the feet, right? And you can start to kind of, maneuver the metaphor any way you want, right? But you get to kind of see it. Ori was Emi, the breath of God, right? The sacred words of God, what animated the human clay or the clay that became humans, right? There's an essence in God in each and every one of us. And Ori and understanding Ori is key. Obviously, there's a huge journey that Ori took before he descended down to earth, but you guys get the point. Think of Ori like your spiritual operating system. We all love computers. We all love our phones, right? I got my phone somewhere nearby. But nonetheless, it has a computer chip. Nonetheless, it has a motherboard. Nonetheless, it has a processing system. Your Ori is your operating system, okay? And if it's not maintained, right? If you're not feeding it, if you're not charging it, if you're not updating the software, right? Then no matter what, how many apps, do you truly have at the end of the day, right? And that's going to be important to understand. Hey, little boy, Abucheche, Marcella, good to see you out here. So, so when you look at it, and no matter how many apps, whether it's orishas, ceremonies, right, bosses, the more you stack on there, that operating system bogs down. Right? If you go to a computer guy, he says, hey, you need more memory. You need a more powerful operating system. And you get those upgrades, right? And it's funny, I got a funny story. So this morning, my phone actually operating system was getting updated. So that was something that is important to understand. Nah, but the boy Abucheche, David, good to see you out here, my friend. Good to see you. Hell yeah. That's that's on Olokun, David. And we just talking about Olokun. So so again, it won't run correctly if you bog the system down. The system needs to be reinforced. Ori needs to be understood. And that's the reason why that becomes a fundamental Orisha. Okay. Now, in today's world, right? Today's world, right? We have to ensure that we are feeding and staying aligned with Ori. And I'm going to leave it there. You guys get the point. That's why Ori is fundamental. Right? Another thing that people receive when it comes to Lukumi, right? Because a lot of times people forget that in Lukumi lineage, right? And I'm gonna throw a disclaimer out there, right? And I don't want nobody to get mad, and I don't want nobody to come at me. But maybe I've mentioned this and maybe I haven't, right? You can't cross streams, right? When I say crossing streams, I mean you gotta understand the lineage that you are in. Are you in an Isheshe lineage or are you in a Lukumi lineage? Ifá is foundational. Ifá is for everybody. Ifá doesn't have a lineage per se. But how we get to the end result as Babalaos, right? How I get to the end result of you is all based on how we begin. All right. And because this next divinity that I'm going to talk about, I want to make sure that that is 100% clear because I'm going to talk to you about a very distinguished and distinction between two things that is important to understand. So if you're in the Isheshe practice and you go through a process called Asentaye, and Itefa, you go through some form of similarity of receiving a hand of Ifá, you stay in that lineage. You're Isheshe. You don't decide that I'm going to take something from Lukumi and I'm going to incorporate it into my Isheshe. That can be very dangerous. And for Aleyos, if you see those actions, you need to you need to put up a flag and you need to have an honest conversation. One perspective only, and that's me, right? Hey, Boro boy Abucheche, Moyo. Always good to see you on there, right? Hey, for the subscribers can chat on the chat group. That's why I can only see certain people. So anybody who wants to subscribe, you know what I mean, to sign up for one of the memberships, bam, do it so I can see your questions and I can answer those questions if you need it. Well, Moyo, always great to see you on, and always thanks for the support. So again, if you start Isheshe, go Isheshe. If you're Lukumi, go Lukumi, right? And here's why I say this, because your way you started from and how you started has a certain level of ache. We hear a lot of people say ache this, ache that, right? And ache is a divine energy or divine blessing. It's a lot of times used as a salutation, right? Or a confirmation during a conversation. But something that needs to be understood is that that divine energy follows you, right? And it's a stream of energy that comes all the way across from point A to point wherever, A, B, C, D, E, the energy flows. And that energy is complemented, right? That Ifá energy is complemented through ancestral worship, so your Egun, and is also complemented, right, by the Orishas, right? That's why I tell people, listen, um, Ifá is the umbrella. And in that umbrella, you have Orumila and the things that Orumila does with his disciples, the Babalaos. You have the Orishas that manage and maintain the earth and how the world rotates, right? And then you have the Eguns, the ancestral blessings, the ancestral curses, and the things that the Eguns can bring to the table to ensure that we begin to remove some of that karmic debt, some of that ancestral debt, maybe bring in some of the ancestral blessings. All those things line up, right? And that's Ifa. And it's grasping onto that Ifa energy, and that's how you get to where you got to get to. Now, here's why I'm getting to this, and this is why I say this. So the Babalaos introduce a certain energy. That energy can counteract other energies if we're not careful, right? And here's what I'm getting at. In Lukumi, we do something called the Teja de Egun. That's one. In Lukumi, we do something called a spiritual Misa to investigate the spirits that walk with you, right? That's done through mediumship. That's done through a conglomerate, right, of different systems. Again, during the slave trade, we created systems, right, to better connect through the land of the Congos in Africa. You know, we look at the Haitian practices. This is where hoodoo came in. This is where mediumship came in. This is where spiritualism came in. And this was something that was truly created and consecrated within a Lukumi lineage style, right? Right. And now you have an understanding. You got Tejas, you got spiritual misas, you got mediumship, spiritualism. All these things reside in this energy. Now, in the Isheshe side of the house, well, on the Ifa side, let me not negate you receive Orun, right? And a lot of the other consecrations we do have a strong connection to Egun, right? Are reinforced with Egun in order to ensure that, you know, the connection is strong. Okay, in Isheshe side, and I'm not an Isheshe Bawalao, so I don't choose to be a professional there, but I want to make sure that nonetheless, that's understood before I say these next things. Because in Isheshe, hey, Boroboy Bucheche, TS, MUSIKTV. Iburu, Lu, many blessings and good morning. Hey, Buru to you, my friend. So when you start to look at Isheshe lineage, they are also reinforcing that Ifa lineage and that Ifa energy that you're receiving from the start. So if you start at Isheshe, then you begin to kind of see the things like Egbe Orun, right? You begin to kind of see the Egungun. You begin to kind of see that those things start to kind of reinforce also, right? That Ifá stream of energy, right? And this is not me even touching the Orisha concepts of things, right? Because I tell everybody there's a trifecta. So that lineage has to follow that trifecta. So Lukumi is always looking at, Orumila side of the house is always looking at Orisha side of the house and Egun side of the house. Ishashe is doing the same thing, that trifecta. They just go about the Eguns, right? Very much different, and we got to be very cautious about how we're doing it. So you can't mix streams. Why? Because when we talk about eguns, I'm talking about your eguns. I'm talking about where you live. I'm talking about the land that you follow. I'm talking about that when we say our moyumba, which is another thing for another video, right? I think everybody should learn a moyumba, one way, shape, or form, right? Doesn't matter where you came from or where you're going. The Moyumba is you giving praise to God first. Moyumba Lodumari, Moyumba Tio Wo, Moyumba Tio Orun, Moyumba. And you go down that road giving praise to God. But when you get to a certain point in that Moyumba, you got to give thanks to your Egun. Where did your Ifá birth from? Your hand of Ifá, whether you're crowned, not crowned, whatever, I don't want to hear any of that. But it was born from something. Everything Ifá is born from something. It's not just created from air, right? Now, so I say this to say that if you knew that something was born from something, right, and now you understand that that lineage is connected, those energies are connected, and they all came from people who have died, people who have blood, sweat, tears, have probably ran into the fire trying to preserve this faith. You got to be careful how you cross those streams, right? It can be offensive to a certain point to the ancestral side of the house, and you got to be careful. So now let me talk about the fundamental Orisha, because now that you have the base, you kind of have an understanding. All right. So we talk about Orun. We receive Orun, right, on the Lukumi side. In Isheshe, they got Igbe Orun. Okay, very beautiful, right? This is spoken through in Ifá, through the Oduns of Irosun Ika, Ikafun, Oturasa, right? Owani Osa. You talk about, there's a lot of concepts there that begin to reinforce the concept of Orun. Igbe Orun, which is your spiritual double on each side, or Orun, which is, and not just a place in Lukumi. And I'm tired of people saying that. I'm tired of people trying to go back and redo the homework that our ancestors did. I understand the definition of Orun. I do. I understand where it came from. I ain't mean to understand what Olorun came. I understand that you gotta remember that there's metaphoric purpose and metaphoric studies that need to be done. So we need to understand Orun in a deeper sense. Many people today, right, suffer in isolation, failed relationships, cycles of loss are all rooted in unresolved Orun issues, right? The lack of connection with the other side. And whether you're Isha Share Lukumi, that is where my explanation of those two lineages comes into play. Right. So now if you find yourself in an Isha She side, Egungun becomes critical, Igbe becomes critical, and you begin to see where that's important. If you're a Lukumi side, then you begin to kind of see, and there's probably more in Isha She. Remember, I'm not an Isha She Bawala. I want to just make sure we talk about that. But in the Lukumi side of the house, you begin to see where we see the alignment of Orun and spiritual misas and spiritual consultations. We begin to see the mediumship, the spiritualism. We talk about the concepts of getting scratched in Palo Moyumbe. We talk about how far does somebody get scratched within Palo Moyumbe because we're trying to align them. Not everybody needs to be a tata or a yeye. And all these things start to kind of play mystical role, right? But it's foundational, and that's the key. That's the understanding, right? So lining yourself up with your egus is the alignment that reconnects you with your spiritual tribe, right? Your original destiny, your companions, right? Those that you may have descended with, right? Or those that are waiting for you on the other side to give you the blessings and the reinforcement that you need to push you forward today, right? In today's world, right, of loneliness and depression for some, right? That can be rooted there, right? This can restore that deep purpose and that relationship and harmony in your life. And understanding those eguns are going to be very important. This falls very, very much in line with why in Lukumi is very vital after you receive your hand of Ifá. And some even get misas before their hand of Ifá. Very respectable, right? Because in Lukumi, I personally believe, and I'm just one person, that you need to always honor the ancestors first before you go into any ceremonies or initiation. That's the reason why in Lokumi and a lot of different Ile spiritual houses, we go to Eguns first. We honor our ancestors and then we move out. Thank you for the hearts for pushing those out. But so now we got to begin to see that we attended the Eguns, but now that we are done with a certain perspective of foundation and receiving your hand to be fine, everything else, in that mix of foundational things you need to do next, you need to now receive a spiritual misa. Pírete, pírete. Those spiritual misas are clear, or they begin to clear up some unresolved issues that you may have ancestrally with the Eguns. If the Eguns are unbalanced, if they're blocking your progress, no matter how many Orishas you receive, if your Eguns are off balance, you're going to have a serious problem. And that needs to be understood. A lot of times people don't understand that the Eguns come in different ways. You got good Eguns, right? And you got bad Eguns. You picked up something that's obsessed and that's tormented and still not necessarily resting, or you pick something up that's going to help drive a positive change in your life. And we got to distinguish those things, right? And that's why Ifá sometimes comes down and says, hey, honor your ancestors, right? Or, hey, you have a Egun Buruku. And you say, what's that? Well, it's not a good thing, right? It's something that's causing a blockage and it's coming from that side of the house. The spiritual misas begin to show me who is your spirit guide, who's your ancestral partner, who's the one that's going to walk with you and also reinforce, right? Because between the Egun, your spirit guide, between your guardian Orisha, who guards your head, right? What crown do you have on, or what crown can you possibly have on? Those two elements are reinforcing the concept of Ori to assure that your destiny is moving. That's something that has to happen, okay? Ancestral trauma is real. We have to understand what the Egun side of the house looks like, right? So science now confirms, right, that it passes through what they call an epigenetics. Epigenetics is something that's passed down to generation. It's no different than, hey, if your parents had cancer, you're probably going to get cancer because your bloodline suffers from that concept of cancer and it's not necessarily purified. So we got to find different ways to purify the bloodline. Spiritually speaking, we have ancestral trauma too, whether it's health, whether it's emotions, you name it, right? Maybe you grew up and you went through some things and you just never got over it. And that passes on from bloodline to bloodline because you raised your children the way you were raised, or you try to overcompensate for something you didn't like, and now you're overcompensating, get the word, right? And then that begins to inherently block certain destiny paths or milestones that need to be met, right? So you got to kind of think about that a little bit, right? So spiritual misas are not optional in Lukumi. You have to do it. Hopefully, you can get it done within the first year you receiving your hand of Ifá and your warriors, right? It's a preventative maintenance, right, for your life, right? Definitely schedule it. Talk to your godparents to make sure you do it. Because I always tell people, listen, your Ifá godfather is going to be a pivot point for you because he is that Ifá energy. He does fall in the land of Orumila as a disciple, right? But he should have relationships on the both sides of the house, the Egun side of the house, the Orisha side of the house, right? Because a lot of times in Lukumi, you begin to see where I have an Oba Oriate, a no kidding, master of ceremonies of Orishas. I have masters of ceremonies in the Egun side of the house. I have mediums that I contact that I trust, that I understand, and I know that they're the real deal because obviously nowadays you always got to be careful with scammers. So that's a big important piece there. All right. Now we understand that. We understand the Egun side of the house, right? Now we got something called Ozain. I'm just going to quickly touch on Ozain, right? Not everybody needs to receive Orun for the Egun side, right? Of Ifá. Not everybody needs to receive Ozain for the Ifá. But if you have to receive Ozain, I think that's a beautiful thing. Ozain will complement you no matter where you go and how you get there. You know what I mean? And that is something for sure that you have to always look at, right? Ozain is the herbs, right? Osanyin is the power. Osanyin governs the power of the leaves, right? And what do herbs do? Medicine, protection, healing baths. But they also are fundamental to everything we do in this energy stream that I was explaining to you earlier. And that's important. Osain in the Lokumi side, because I'm Isha side, Osain is a little bit more of a rarity to receive, and I will allow those elders to explain that. So I'm not going to get into that. But in the Lokumi side, Osain is very fundamental for those who want to look towards the priesthood of things, becoming babalaos, get crowned and become obaoriates, because nonetheless, everything comes back to the leaves. Everything will come back to leaves being fundamental of washing, cleaning, right? Orishas to be born into this world or connected to this world or be consecrated, or however way you want to look at it. If you look at the signs like Oshetura, Otura Ogunda, Obesa, you see the essence of Osanyin and the importance of Osanyin. And so I always tell people that receiving Osanyin is like natural medicine, right? It's coming back for a reason, right? Natural medicine is coming back for a reason because the modern pharmaceutical world, right, alone cannot fix the problems that are aiding this world, right? Its spiritual roots is the illness. And this is the reason why our faith has grown. Our faith is out there. Our faith is in the public eye. Our faith, collectively, when you talk about the indigenous faith of where it lands, and the reason why they call it an indigenous faith is because it's not one of the three major, right, religions of the world, but nonsense. Nonsense. I give consultations to pastors and let me not even get into that. But it's okay because Ifá has religious tolerance, and that's okay. That's okay. But working with Osain deepens that ability to heal, protect yourself in a toxic world, right? And that's important. All right. TSMSU. I don't even know how to say that. I'm sorry. TS Music TV. All right. Hey, I'm in Orlando and I'm looking for a piridita for misas. Hey, TS Music TV. Hey, I have folks in Tampa, I have folks in Miami. I'm not gonna say me, my wife. My wife's a piritita, and she works with people out there. Um, you know, and my spiritual house comes from the Tampa area. Buro boy buche to my elders, and they buy my house, Arturo, Juan Imoso, my godfather, um, who's over in the Tampa area, right? People, right, in West Waters. But yeah, if you need more information, definitely shoot me an email. I'll put my email in here because obviously I got to start wrapping it up because guess what? I got to get to my job. But and then let's see. Yeah, definitely shoot me an email and we can link you up, right? Or whenever we're giving our spiritual misas to our folks in our ile, right? We schedule these things out in advance. Maybe my wife can add you to the docket, but we're here to help nonetheless. Can anybody receive Osain? No, not anybody can just receive Osain. Osain is very temperamental. And because of how Lokumi, and this is where Orun, Ozain, there's quite a few things that get mounted with the very essence of Egun, right? And with the very aspects and the cargas and the charge and this is the reason why things are expensive. And I'm glad you mentioned that, TSTV, because a lot of times people don't understand what goes into, different elements, of consecrations, right? So when we talk about the carga, the charge, there's times when there's things that are precious metals. You know, when you talk about platinum, gold, silver, you're talking about different ingredients that you can't even get in the US. You know, you're talking about sometimes where it's actual bones of actually different animals. It can be of ancestors. It could be, I mean, trust me, it's all types of things, right? And that's just touching the tip of the iceberg. The more ingredients, right? When you talk about things that are exotic, you know, and you have to get some things maybe hush hush from time to time, but those things got to be put together in order to create the concoction, in order for the energy of that Orisha to be pure and to be able to spread itself out and to assist you where it needs to be assisted. A lot of different things there. And I'm not necessarily going to go into the secrets of how things are charged because that would be inappropriate for me to reveal secrets. Um, but it's good for you guys to have an understanding. So for Ozain, to go back to your original question, once women hit menopause, they can qualify to receive what's called the Weedle of Ozain, right? Which is a Weedle is it's basically a shell, right? That's charged so that they can have it and work it, right? Then the men can get it, right? And they get it in three stages, which is the daw, the cazuela, which is the base, and then the Weedle, right? So as long as we understand those separations, that's going to be key. All right. So then the last thing I want to talk about before I got to get out of here is going to be feeding the earth. Okay. Feeding the earth is pretty self-explanatory. Oyekun Ilobe, or Oyekun Obe, talks about it. Obeyono. Every time you hear Obeyono, I want you guys to remember that's important. Otura Ogunda, right? When you start to kind of see those things, it's important for us that, you know, without feeding the earth, right, your spiritual work is unsupported. All the abodes and offerings pass through when we talk about Ileogere, right, the earth. Right? All your abodes and your offerings got to pass through the earth. They're completed on earth. They got to pass through the earth. So why not feed the earth? This is the reason why this is very critical, especially for those who have, you know, property, right? If you own your piece of land, and that is your land, your family's land, ancestral land, you lived in that house for generations, this is the thing for you. If you don't, this is still the thing for you. And I'm just saying it's more of a thing for those folks, right? Because you got to give back to the earth. What the earth took, the earth will give. What the earth gives, the earth will take. It is 100%. Irete Ogunda tells us that. All right, so very important. All right, Moyo. Yeah, I'm curious. Is it a problem that some Iles give Hand of Ifá first while others give Elekes then warriors? Um, Here's my thing. All right. And I remember I leave. If you guys don't know, I got a podcast. In that podcast is where I really talk about all these controversial things. But hey Moyo, you're a subscriber, you're a member, so I owe you an answer and I'm gonna give it to you. All right, where I typically want it. Now, elekes. If I'm going to give you an eleke ceremony, right? I'm gonna get you a nice little elekes, you're gonna be all Gucci, right? You're gonna get all your orishas. Here's the thing with the Eleke ceremony that I still yet to understand. Right? You can't. You gotta go to Ifá first, which means you have to go to the Babalaos first in order to get that initial stream of energy. If you receive Elekes without understanding who's your guardian Orisha, doesn't that kind of just defeat the purpose? Shouldn't you know who your guardian Orisha is first? So receiving your hand of Ifá probably will complement that concept. And then when we talk about the concept of Elekes, Elekes is a big deal. You know what I mean? And I'm not gonna speak for the land of Ocha, right? The land of the Orishas and how they give their Elekes, right? But I would say that that needs to be a pretty well scripted ceremony, right? In order to ensure that we understand what those Elekes are, right? Because if you're going to give something or a power or an initiation or a ceremony type thing, right, you need to make sure that you're doing that, right, through the backs of those orishas, right? This is not, let me go buy a couple of leques in the botanica, wash them with some miedo and say, bah, we're good. Nah, I think it's a little bit more than that, right? So those ceremonies always kind of rub me a little bit off. Again, everybody does things differently. I'm not here to judge one or the other, but just things to realize that when people are doing things out of order, right, then you need to ask yourself, okay, do I understand the philosophical side of things, the cosmological side of things, right? This is the reason why it's important to develop, folks. Do not allow yourself to just stay, you know, mute or to stay ignorant, right, in the faith. Learn as much as you can. Challenge the status quo. But when I say challenge respectfully, right, you bring those questions to your elders. So hopefully that helps you. So Ifá's got to happen first. Hopefully, I answered your question. Not necessarily Elekes, because you don't know who your guardian Orisha is, and that begins to build that conflict. So, no, great question, William. Great question. So I think we understand. So, feeding the earth again, making sure that between the climate crises, the environmental imbalances, reconnecting to the earth, especially not only to support your life, right? It honors and helps and heals the systems within you, the connection within you, the connection with the Eguns, right? We talk about digging the hole, right? Making sure that all that is done appropriately and we give back to the earth so the earth can give us back that agriculture, those blessings, those connections with our ancestors, all those things. Those are things that happen behind this sacred ceremony of feeding the earth. Right? It honors and helps kind of heal kind of that very system, that we depend on. It helps stabilize your life, your career, your relationships, your home. I mean, it's so many great things that come, and this is why this is also fun. Right? Feed the earth at least, if you can. You can do it with Iyebale, so through blood sacrifice once a year, maybe once every other couple of years. Um, you know, or you can find there's many ceremonies that your house or your godfather or godmother can help you kind of better understand how to better do that in a more simplistic way where you can do it. And those things are out there. All right, no, perfect. All right, guys. Hey, as much as I wanted to kind of dig in further, um, I think this is where we have to depart. I know I got to leave here in 10 minutes and I'm already I'm already kind of ready to go. So with that said, hey, Iburu, Iboya, Ibuche, everybody in Cyberland, thank you for all the support, all the things that you guys bring to the table. I want to make sure I give my shout out right to Taishan, Omo Dudua, to Moyo, who's been engaging, right? We got Adam, I think it's Adam, Adiam, right? Nathaniel, right, for joining. Janae, Lewis, thank you for joining. Those are those who subscribe to the memberships, those who are able to kind of type and talk along, because those guys are always in there. So I appreciate all the support to the channels, right? And again, every penny counts. Why? Because it supports the nonprofit side of the house and making sure that people who don't have for warriors or Hand of Ifá are able to push forward and receive those things, right? So that's the idea, right, behind charging for things. And also it supports because I got to pay for Zoom and Microsoft and all that stuff. But hey, guys, hey, Buru, Iboya, Bucheche, Cyberline, you guys have a blessed and great morning or evening coming in the European theater. But Iburu, Iboya, Ibucheche.